From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Next week is an exciting week for me. I'm going to be getting some plants from the Benton Soil and Water Conservation District native plant sale. Imagine many of you have also gotten some plants, but you're wondering, which plant should I get? What do I need to put in my landscape, my garden, my woodlot to bring it up to snuff so that it is really firing on all ecological cylinders? Well, that's where my next guest comes in. Susie Peterson works for the Columbia Land Trust as one of two co-managers for the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. In this episode, we're going to hear about that program and how they've got tremendous resources for you to not only recognize your property as backyard habitat, but also to be able to give you advice on how to bring it up to the top level. I also want to make a shout out for the 10th annual Pollinator Conference, BVent, that happens in Albany every year. It's going to be at the Lynn County Fair and Expo. It's March 2nd, and it's going to feature James Hung, who from Oklahoma State University is going to be the keynote speaker. There's also going to be all sorts of speakers and vendors at this conference. If you want to also take your garden up a notch and you're in the Pacific Northwest, come join us in Albany March 2nd, and you can find out more information about the conference at the Lynn County Master Gardener website. Okay, without further ado, let's learn about backyard habitat conservation, backyard habitat certification this week on Pollination. It's soon to be a stormy day in Western Oregon. I'm really excited to invite you, Susie, to Pollination.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Anthony.
I'm really excited. I've been admiring the Backyard Habitat Certification Program as many Oregonians have, and I thought it was a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about the program. And I guess, to start off, people who are familiar with the program think of their backyard as habitat, but for many Oregonians, habitat is not a term that most people associate with their backyards. So just begin by describing why it's important to focus on increasing habitat in urban areas.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think a lot of people think of nature and habitat as being something that's kind of out there. You drive 30 minutes or an hour out into the forest, and that's where wildlife live. That's where they thrive. But there are a lot of studies now that show that wildlife can really thrive in urban areas. And in Oregon, so many of our cities have become really densely populated. I imagine it's this way where you are, but certainly in the Portland, Vancouver area, just building developments have taken over so much land, and the amount of yard space that those new developments have is significantly less than older homes have with larger yard spaces. So just the options for where salamanders and frogs and birds can go to find food and shelter is decreasing on a daily basis. I know in our area in particular, a lot of the wetland species are really suffering. We used to have so many wetlands in this area where the Willamette and the Columbia meet, and so much of that has been taken over by large, multi-story condominiums and so forth right on the waterfront that really pushed out the kind of habitat that those aquatic species needs. So frogs and salamanders in particular are really suffering. But yeah, I think what people are beginning to realize more and more is that you don't have to have a large piece of land to make a difference. You can really talk to anyone who's implemented any kind of recommendations that we make, and they will tell you that they've noticed increases in the number of different species of birds that visit their yards, and lots of other wildlife as well. So the whole concept of the program is that 1 yard makes a difference, but what really makes a difference is if you have 10,000 yards working in alignment together, neighbors, side to side, building habitat, then you can really create these wildlife corridors that move through the urban areas. So you're essentially connecting these larger pieces of land that are being conserved or being utilized as parks or other types of green spaces. You're basically through the neighborhoods creating these connections between these larger green spaces. And I think when the program first rolled out in 2000, like between 2006, 2009, that was kind of its launching phase. I think there were a lot of questions around how big of a difference a program like this would make. And now, we easily talk to lots of city councils and get lots of funding from cities and other agencies who like recognize, it's really easy to see now, like everybody has a story or knows somebody who has a story about being in the program and seeing that change in their yard and seeing the wildlife, birds and butterflies and pollinators coming into their yards by focusing on native plants and the other things that we recommend. So once you see it in action, it's really clear. But we so often live in homes and yards and neighborhoods where there's so much lawn or so much lack of plant diversity that you don't really get to see that. But yeah, every year you'll see a few studies coming out by people who are doing research and are finding that a lot of wildlife can really do okay and even thrive in urban areas if we dedicate enough yards to it.
Well, I love the way that you described, the genesis of the program and doubts of whether you would have these, but there are these wonderful heat maps on the backyard habitat certification website where you could just see the density of dots and yards being connected that, really, over time it has proven its capacity to really put a footprint on, in the Portland metro area of habitat creation.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we've honestly we've been surprised, I would say, by the really strong response to a program like this. I think yeah, we've been surprised. I think a lot of people are looking for a way to make a contribution. There's a lot of information about bee species that are on decline, especially native bee species, or those wetland species I was talking about being in decline. And I think a lot of people read about this and are aware of this and really want to do something to make a difference, really want to do something to help, but don't always know what to do. And so a program like ours or any of the other programs that are similar to ours around the country that can show up in a person's yard, make some specific recommendations, keep it simple, keep it easy, that's a really useful and handy thing for a person to have when they're looking to make a difference. And it's something they can do in their backyard after supper time with their kids back there playing in the yard. Like it's a very accessible way to make to kind of interact with nature in your backyard and to be part of something larger that in a cumulative way makes a big difference.
Well, I love it. We actually had a listener that we did an episode with who is in New Mexico who had a similar experience. And it was really remarkable the way it launched him because he now has this amazing species inventory on his property. It's just, but this was kind of, he credited having this program and having somebody come on site and provide some basic consultation as, spiraling him off into really thinking about biodiversity in his backyard. And I guess this is one of the real strengths of the program, makes it so unique, is, having somebody with some conservation background and who knows some of the skills and some of the steps do an assessment of your property. Can you describe? I really love that aspect. I think it's so unique. Can you describe what an assessment entails, and what are some of the common recommendations that you sort of? I'm sure there's a pattern sometimes that do this or do that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you're right. I think often people just need a place to get started. And then once they have a few pieces of information, they kind of build on that either with the tools that a program like ours provides or even on their own. So I see our site visits as being really like partially providing information and recommendations, but really just having a conversation so that the person we're visiting feels like they can be successful. Because I think a lot of times people get overwhelmed. So in our site visits, what we'll do, we take about an hour and we will
Wow,
show yeah, it's like
amazing.
we really want it to be an effective visit, so
Hmm.
we dedicate an hour to it. And we show up, we bring a welcome, what we call our welcome packet. It's basically a booklet. It's a folder that has different handouts. It has coupons for native plants at our local nurseries, and informative handouts, brochures, things with information and coupons and things like that. So we show up with this welcome packet, and we basically talk to the participant about what their interests are, because we want it to feel relevant to them and their lives as
Oh,
well. And
uh-huh.
so we'll ask questions like, what are you interested in? Are you interested in pollinators? Maybe we want to talk about a wildflower meadow. Or are you interested in growing a lot of your own food? Maybe we should be talking about how to plant native plants that will bring in pollinators to help pollinate that food that you want to grow. Or maybe they're interested, maybe they have a lot of deer. Maybe they're in an area with a lot of deer. Like, what plants can you plant where that the deer might not eat? Or maybe they have water running through their property. Up here, we have a lot of properties that actually have like seasonal or year-round streams or creeks going through them, and that can become a lot to manage in the winter when there's a lot of water. So we kind of learn from them what their experience has been in their yard, what they're interested in, and then we try to tailor kind of the recommendations around that. But you're right, there are some key things that we always speak to. Like, we have what we call our 5 core elements in the program. The first one is native plants. So we'll share lists of native plants and why those are so important to our native wildlife. We'll talk about invasive weed species and identify any that we see on their property. We talk about stormwater management, which means which can look very different depending on where they are and what the soil and land type is like where they are. We talk about reducing or eliminating the use of pesticides and provide a resource where they can look up the toxicity level of anything that they're currently using. And then we talk about wildlife stewardship. So what are things that they can do to specifically provide food, water, shelter for birds and other wildlife in their yards? So those are the key things that we do, that we talk about during the visit. And then afterwards, we provide it's about a 5 to 6 page written site report that kind of specifies, like, here's the existing site, and here's the existing site conditions, and then it goes through each of those 5 core elements and provides either lists of plants or a menu of options of like things that they
Uh,
can do to create habitat.
so it comes up. I imagine sometime later you'll get this report that comes back to you, and it says, "Here are some of the things you can do."
Yep.
And I suppose, let's say you can't meet them all. Does that kind of disqualify you, or is there a kind of there are steps?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you want. Some people are really motivated by certification. And if that's what motivates you, then we spell out really clearly in the site report what to do to get certified. But we want everybody to be in the program, even if
Mhm.
you're not really interested in certification, or maybe there's something that would be required in order to get certified, but that's not a thing you want to do, that's totally fine. Even just being in the program, even if you don't get certified, makes a huge difference. And there's plenty of things that people do, even when they're not getting certified, that's incredibly helpful to wildlife. So I think this is a really important point, because we have a lot of folks who reach out to us and they live in apartment complexes. Maybe they don't have a yard, but they have a balcony and they want to have potted plants or things
Oh
like
yeah.
that. So I feel like it's just really important for folks who don't have the privilege of owning land to recognize that they can do things that may not get them certified, but are still incredibly helpful to wildlife. So I'm just going to insert that into this section, because I feel like that's a point that a lot of people miss when they think about our program. And I think we could do a better job of communicating that too. But yes, to your point, getting certified is actually pretty easy for, like, let's say that I came to your yard.
Yeah.
And the site report I would send afterwards would say, Anthony, you're doing so much in your yard already. That's great. Here's a few things you can do to increase habitat in your yard. And the amount of native plants you would need to plant would only need to cover 5% of your yard. So that's
Okay.
a pretty small area.
Yeah, sure.
And we do recommend that people focus it on a certain area, so that, for example, if you're planting things that draw in bees, they don't have to go very far. They can kind of stay in that area. So we do talk about like picking one part of your yard where you kind of focus on naturescaping, and then you can have the multiple native canopy layers, which is really helpful for wildlife. So there are specific things, but the whole idea of our different certification levels, because we have the silver level, which is kind of like the entry level, and then you can move on up to gold and on up to platinum. And each time you do more. So for silver, you only need 5% of your yard to be planted with native plants. But for gold, we're asking for 15%, or for platinum, we're asking for 50%.
Wow.
So that's a way for us to kind of provide some framework of how you can think about like the quantity of habitat that you're providing.
Oh, that's really
But
helpful. Yeah.
yeah, so there are some certain things, like there are some certain weeds that you would need to remove to get certified and things like that. But people get to choose what they want to do, and even certification is part of that decision.
I really love what you said earlier as well around accessibility and making sure that, everybody who wants to contribute has a way into the program. I think that's really wonderful. And I noticed, for example, there's some fees associated, but also, there's a kind of sensitivity to, people's capacity to, because I imagine this program, I can a program where somebody comes to your property and gives you a 1 hour consultation. Like, where in the world do you get that?
Yeah,
That's pretty
right.
amazing. Yeah.
It is, and you're right. We do a lot of fundraising. We apply for a lot of grants, and we have a lot of city and agency partners to help cover those costs, because a big goal of ours is to remove barriers to accessing a program like ours versus cost can be a big barrier, especially when native plants they are pretty expensive.
Mhm.
It can take a long time to buy as many plants as you need to even get certified. So because of the cost. So yeah, that is a way that we try to keep things accessible, is to have a sliding scale for our enrollment fee, so that folks can choose what they're comfortable paying to get into the program.
It's amazing. Well, it's no surprise to me that the program has grown so rapidly. And I imagine it's been exciting to watch this growth. It just, thinking back to the earlier part of the conversation is like, will this ever connect? And now it's connecting in lots of ways. So I just wanted to hear your reflections on what excites you about that growth, but also, what are some of the big challenges in keeping this program? I imagine the telephone calls and the emails, it must be, there's so much interest in this program. Tell us a little bit about how you sort of see the future.
Oh, wow. That's a big question. Yeah, you're right. We've had a lot of growth over the last like 5 years. Even we've grown the program from being in one county to being in 4 counties. And so I think what excites me is we're now at over 12,000 participants in the
Oh,
program, which still just
wow.
it still blows my mind.
Uh-huh.
And it's really amazing on those heat maps that you were talking about earlier to like see those connections and see those spots where corridors are being created, where wildlife corridors are being created. um I think as the program grows, it just becomes more, what's the word I'm looking for? Relevant, I think,
Mhm.
because the more people who are engaged, the more we can grow those wildlife corridors and the more wildlife can see that and can respond to it and can utilize it. So that really excites me. I think it also excites me to think about how each one of those 12,000 people care enough to
Huh.
spend their free time out in their yard pulling ivy, pulling blackberry, which like shreds your clothes. And, I mean, there's the staff and there's our technicians, but really the people doing the hard work are those 12,000 participants. So to think of them, out there on the weekends, out there after work, like doing this like really hard labor, but also very fun and also very gratifying. I think that really inspires me and makes me feel hopeful in an era where it can be difficult to find hope, right? So
For sure. I always delight when I'm on social media. Like, you don't like to go on the social media these days, but you see somebody holding up their aluminum sign. They've reached another, and they're so proud. I run across this maybe, with increasing frequency, just people who achieve certification and just the sense of pride in being part of a larger initiative, but also just in their own effort in contributing to conservation. It's really wonderful to see.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think one thing we really strive for is to create a sense of community and provide opportunities to share resources. And when you ask the question of like, what do you see in the future? What excites you about the future? That's the thing that we there's so much potential there, and there's so much more we could be doing. And that's the direction we really want to head into, is thinking about like how to connect people to each other, to help with removing weeds, to help with plantings, to help to share native plants and those types of things. So yeah, I appreciate that you mentioned that.
Well, maybe just to um, kind of put a bow on this, just to tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've seen. I imagine you've seen a lot of properties kind of go through transformations, and tell us about some that just come to mind. I imagine it's hard to sort of select. There's probably so many of them, but give us some vignettes of what you see out in the world of the backyard habitat certification world.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of my favorite stories and things that I've seen revolve around surprising species that have shown up. So, for example, there's a story of I used to live in a part of Portland that's kind of outer East Portland, and there's not a lot of green spaces in that area. And I had someone sign up who was maybe like a quarter of a mile away from me in a similar like area where it's a lot of concrete, very built up, not a lot of green spaces. And she, between when she got her site visit and after she planted her native plants and did her habitat creation, she ended up finding a family of, or some, I can't remember now the quantity, but like she found salamanders underneath,
Oh, wow.
cornhole, that game, that yard game
Yeah.
cornhole. She had a cornhole box,
Uh,
and she found salamanders underneath
oh
it.
my
And she
goodness.
took care, she like kept them safe and tried to keep cats and dogs away and things like that. And that really blew my mind because it's just an area where you just don't picture them being, but they were there on the landscape, just looking for, I guess, a cornhole box. I don't know, maybe we should add that to our list of like wildlife stewardship options.
Might have to be put on the checklist.
I think we do. I think we do. Yeah, so that was really exciting. And then similarly, I guess I get inspired by in these really urban areas where you just assume that you're not going to see anything interesting and then you see it. Similarly, in kind of a northeast part of Portland, there was a guy who really loved frogs, like Pacific chorus frogs. And he built a pond and like surrounded it with native plants and all of the things that would fit with like that
Oh,
aquatic wetland area in a small, like 5,000 square foot lot,
wow.
just very basic size urban lot. And he ended up with like a bunch of Pacific chorus frogs, and they weren't just there once, they were like there on a continual basis, and that was
Ah,
their home. And the family grew from this one little family that showed up, so it's yeah, I think what was the old movie where it was like, if you build it they will
so that
come,
they will come. Yeah.
and certainly these are like kind of remarkable stories. I won't pretend like this happens in every single yard, but it does happen, and we do hear about it, and it is it's pretty exciting. So
That is wonderful, and thanks for so much for taking the time. This is a real gem of a program that we have here in Oregon, and it's just always so great to see this program expand and the attention and care that the staff put into it. So thank you so much for giving our listeners a little bit of, for those who are already in the program. I'm sure there's many, but for those who have been thinking about the program, just giving them the broad strokes of how it works.
thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button, where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.